So it's not necessarily quite as new a thing anymore, but when I first read about it, I had never heard anything like that before, and I found it so horrifying and terrifying, and almost like I had said, I knew they weren't buried alive, but it had that same kind of feeling, like these people have been buried alive in the sense that they can't escape from this asphalt. There's no way out.
So, Staten Islander News Organization is here today with Heather Quinlan, who is currently producing and directing a documentary about a forgotten cemetery on Forest Avenue. Heather Quinlan is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, writer, and podcaster with a passion for telling little-known stories, especially about the Big Apple. Her first feature-length film, If These Knishes Could Talk, the story of the New York accent, won the Manhattan Film Festival Spotlight Award and screened at the Library of Congress as well as film festivals across the country. It was featured in The New Yorker, The New York Times, WSJ, BBC, NPR, and HuffPost. It's currently streaming on Apple Plus TV, YouTube, and Google Play. She is the author of 2020's Plagues, Pandemics, and Viruses, From the Plague of Athens to COVID-19, a book about the history of pandemics. Currently, she is the producer and director for Staten Island Graveyard, about an African-American cemetery that was paved over in the 1960s and is now a strip mall. They are in production at this time, and this interview will be mainly focused on that project. So, Staten Island Graveyard is a 1-hour documentary that tells the story of Cherry Lane Cemetery, once the burial ground of anywhere up to 1,000 African Americans on Staten Island, and is now the parking lot of a strip mall. Nearly everyone who lives or works on Staten Island has unknowingly passed by this cemetery. The strip mall, which now covers it, is located on the corner of Forest Avenue and Livermore, and it is believed that the cemetery and church stand where Santander is now. Good morning, Heather, and welcome. We're glad to be with you today.
Hi, thank you.
Okay. So the first question I have is, what made you become interested in the topic of what has happened to slave or African cemeteries nationwide, and how did you learn about this particular cemetery?
Well, I'll start by saying I've always had a fascination for cemeteries. I've always connected with them in terms of, some people see them as kind of spooky, creepy places, but, and yeah, certainly there are ones that are your typical kind of Halloween looking places, but I kind of see them more as kind of calm and serene, and also a whole place to learn about art, history, people, that in a way that you can't necessarily find from documentation, like in the way that people are recorded or on the graves, or the symbolism. Like if you see a lamb on a headstone, it usually means it's someone who died young, for instance. There are graves that are recognizable, from the Victorian era. They were very into big about everything. Like they would have obelisks with Greek keys, and they were like, more is not enough. We need more and more and more. So I've always had a fascination about them. I did not focus on African American cemeteries per se before I started this. What happened was I was working on a follow-up to the Knishes film, and I had done several projects in between, and I wanted to do one on just New York City cemeteries, and it wasn't really more narrower than that at that point. And I knew I was going to have to narrow the scope somehow, but I wasn't quite sure how. And I read a book called Graveyard Shift by a woman named Carolee Inskeep. Her husband is an NPR host. I can't think of his name at the moment, but I didn't know that at the time. And in that book, that was a book about New York City cemeteries. And this is several years ago. It took me several years to actually get through a bunch of projects in order, and I got married, and COVID, and so on and so forth, and the Plagues Pandemics book, and So it took me a while to finally get to pursuing this project. It was 2021 when I started. But when I first read about Cherry Lane, even going back a few years now, we've since heard more and more about these cemeteries, African American and Indigenous in particular, being unearthed because of all the overdevelopment going on across the country. So it's not necessarily quite as new a thing anymore, but when I first read about it, I had never heard anything like that before, and I found it so horrifying and terrifying, and almost like I had said, I knew they weren't buried alive, but it had that same kind of feeling, like these people have been buried alive in the sense that they can't escape from this asphalt. There's no way out, if they're even there. So that is really what got me hooked on the idea of the project and the history. Where it has led, I had no idea it was going to go in these different directions, but that was the initial start. So it didn't start with me wanting to focus on African American cemeteries, but that's where it ended up.
Awesome. So my next question is, can you please explain the relevant laws regarding restoration of old abandoned cemeteries and what they're supposed to provide for or allow?
That's a tricky question. We're a big country and we have many laws. We have our federal, we have our state, we have our municipal. And when it comes to cemeteries, it gets very hazy and the language can get very easily manipulated depending on who has the money, the power, and the stamina as well. There are federal laws that protect, for instance, Native American burial grounds, and particularly artifacts that were stolen, in that manifest destiny to move out west. There were many objects stolen that are in museums now, and George Bush Sr. signed a law in 2000. The acronym is NAGPRA. I can't remember exactly what it stands for, but it's supposed to repatriate these items back to the tribes that they belong to. And this has been an ongoing issue almost a quarter century later of still this fight happening, even though there's a federal law about that. In terms of other burial grounds, the most famous one being the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan, that was fortunate in two ways when it was discovered. A, that it was a federal building that was going to be built there, and indeed it has been built there. It's an IRS building, to add insult to injury. But so the law that protects cemeteries that was enacted in 1966 from exactly what happened when developers come in, they unearth remains that they didn't know were there. They have to put a stop to it, and then people have to come in and start research, and basically the development has to stop for however long. And but that only applies to federal buildings. So say a condo was going to be put there, the same laws would not necessarily apply as they did to an IRS building. The other thing that was in their favor was that David Dinkins was mayor at the time. So he, as an African American, had a particular drive to make sure that this was taken care of in the correct way. He put together a task force. He got the right people involved. He made sure Howard University was the university that would end up being the one that oversaw the research of the remains, that had, specifically, it was a historic Black college instead of your Princetons, your Yales, your Harvards, which have smart people, but not necessarily people who are steeped in knowledge of African culture. So a lot of things were done the right way. I think there are still probably, at the end of the day, development will prevail somehow. And so I don't think every remain was found and accounted for. But as far as America goes, it was a much bigger success story than we usually have. So those are two federal laws that are intended to protect not only the remains, but also the funerary items that are found. But they still have their own issues, and there are still ways that people try and bypass them. And there are state and local laws too, but then you also have to deal with things like cemeteries that are owned by places of worship, and so it's there's not like one law for the whole country that says protect cemeteries here, this, why. It's very complicated. It's very bureaucratic. There's a lot of red tape, and it's a lot of, the government does what the government will do a lot of times when it comes to things like this, is to make it overly complicated.
Okay, so now when it comes to the laws that you were just speaking about, what do the laws do for the Cherry Lane Cemetery in particular?
Well, there was a time where, had we known about this and had this happened, had this unfolded the way that it did unfold today, there is a law called or something called estoppel, which basically says that you can't say one thing when it's legally proven to be another. So for instance, when it comes to Cherry Lane, you can't say legally that this is not a cemetery when there are many municipal naps and death certificates, et cetera, that state that this absolutely was a cemetery. It's a conflict there. And so had we been alive then, or had we been able to know about it then, we could have used the, I don't know what the term is, but we could have used estoppel basically to say, wait a minute, this is illegal. What's happening? You can see on the zoning map that this is a cemetery. You can see on many of these maps that this is a cemetery. You can see on these death certificates that people, in place of interment, it says Cherry Lane Cemetery. So, however, there's a statute of limitations on that. I don't know exactly how long it is. I think it might be 10 years, but we have blown way past that. So we can't use that as a way to, dig up the remains. It's private property now. So we have to rely on not only the owner of the property, but the largesse, so to speak, of the tenants on the property, even though they don't own it. If they could allow things like what we're hoping for, is to get a ground penetrating radar survey done on the site. And for those who don't know what that is, it's non-intrusive. It basically, it looks like a combination metal detector lawnmower, and it can not only find remains, but it can also find the absence of land where there had been people buried. So even if, the remains had degraded to a point, because a lot of people were buried back then, with what would be known as a shroud or a blanket, or if it was a coffin that had, rotted away over the years, they would still find the absence of a body. So there would still be, that taken into account. But we can't just go in and do that for multiple reasons, but one of which is we would need the property owner's approval. And so we are working to try and get that, because that would prove, the direction of where this will go, if there are still remains and if there aren't. I mean, I find it hard to believe, in spite of all the destruction that has happened on that site, that we would find nothing. And as you said, I that area, if you look at the footprint of the site, it's got this weird kind of rectangular section off of the actual strip mall where Santander is and where the parking is. And we think that that area in particular had the most bodies buried there, and possibly where the church was. The church was torn down by 1889. And we know that from a work that was written called Homestead Graves. But we don't know. There's nowhere on a map that specifies, latitude, longitude, church is here. That we don't know. We just know that it seemed like at one point when the land was deeded in 1850, it seemed like it spread from what is now Forest Avenue across to Livermore, and then the other street I can't think of. I think it's Eldridge, and then back as far as Clark Place, which now has houses on it. But over the years, pieces of the property started to be sold off. And so what you end up with, and there is someone who lives on Clark Place who found a statue of what looks like a 19th century African-American woman in his yard. What this will do is show, are there still remains there? The property owner, I don't believe, knew that this had been a cemetery when he bought it. It doesn't seem like it was on the deed or on the title. There was no mention of a cemetery. But the point is, he does know now. So what do we do about it? And Santander Bank, to their credit, has done a lot toward trying to, there's a landscaped area around the bank, and they have set aside funds for Wiesner Brothers Nursery to landscape the property, have it be a memorial garden, particularly along the Livermore side, because it's much more quiet than Forest Avenue. But that has been, that in and of itself has been a debate between, the landowners, lawyers, and Santander lawyers going on over a year now. We're hoping it gets solved soon because it's growing season now, or planting season. But we need to see.
And so the owners of the particular owners of this site now, have they been amenable to kind of the work that you've been doing and kind of working with you, or not really?
No. I don't blame them on the one hand. If I owned a paved over African-American cemetery, I probably would not be thrilled that a documentary filmmaker had burst into my life. And because to jump ahead to a further question of yours, why was this not ever discussed or published? It had been. It's just that not a lot of people kind of took note of it. And again, like I said, when it was written about, I think the idea was maybe people would see the headline and think, oh, this was some old cemetery from the 1600s, and what are we going to do about it? I mean, we're supposed to, it's old. Everyone around these people are dead. Why do we have to? But that's not the case. This was paved over, or this was seized in 1954, and it was a shell station sometime in the late 1950s. So, so what we end up having now is a shopping plaza owned by someone who didn't realize its history. And while on the one hand, he at first was working with Santander because they're a tenant of his, right? So he has a stake on the one hand in making them happy. But on the other hand, he is the property owner. So what he says goes. And he originally was into having a memorial garden. He had told them his grandfather fought in World War II, and there's a memorial that mentions him in Greece. And so he was for it at first, and then for various reasons, he's gotten afraid of it, whether it's because it's becoming real and he doesn't want people to know that this is a cemetery. His claim is that, I don't know, it'll attract homeless people.
That's a real strange argument. Okay.
It's a very odd logic, but again, he's the owner, so he can say it'll attract aliens. I don't want it. It'll attract, men from Mars, and so I don't want it. So no, to answer your question, I mean, I have reached out to him. He's not called me back. I don't suspect we will be talking anytime soon, but at the end of the day, what his actions show are what I need to document more than just a conversation with him. If I have a conversation with him, don't get me wrong, that would be fantastic, but I don't anticipate that happening anytime soon.
And so you said there was a Shell station built there? And then, so, I mean, that would have been like they dig down a lot to put in those gas tanks and stuff. So they would have had to have found the bodies, and then they would have had to be regulated in that, but then they didn't follow the law properly. Because that's also another thing with, what do you call them? Artifacts. When builders start building on a property and they find artifacts, they're supposed to stop. And that's what the law says, but it's in their best interest or financial interest to not stop and to just ignore it and keep going, because if they stop, then they've got to stop for a year or 2 years or whatever amount of time it takes, and then it's money and all this other stuff. So, I guess having it reliant on the profiting party seems like, that's something that they do with a lot of the laws here, where it's like it's a conflict of interest that they create in the law itself.
Correct. It's like trying to appease two sides, and you can't. You got to pick a side. And so right now, the law favors, as it usually does, the people with the money and the power. And so he, has the law on his side right now. And we're just hoping by getting several different organizations involved, religious organizations, legislators, policymakers, to sign a letter asking for this ground penetrating radar to happen, that it might actually happen. And it would help him out too. I mean, we might find, when you talk about, yes, it was a Shell station. They did sink gas tanks into the ground. One thing that I have not been able to find is no one has come forward and said, now probably most of the people who worked on it in the 60s are either very elderly or have passed away, but no one has said, my dad worked on the site and he remembered seeing, skeletons or anything like that. We have found people who remember the site as an empty plot or what looked like an empty plot, but we haven't seen or come across anyone, or even when it was switched from a gas station to the shopping plaza in the 80s, there would probably be people alive who may have come across remains there, and I haven't found anyone, or anyone has said anything about that. One of the things that I think is that, it would also be in the owner's best interest to see if there is a remediation that needs to be done, because given the history of Staten Island and the way that construction and development works, I wouldn't be surprised if those gas tanks were not removed. I don't know, but also, I think the gas station itself was in the part that is the shopping plaza part, and that part that's off to the side did not have those gas tanks in it, did not have the gas pumps. So
So the
that's why
part
I
that
picked
you're
up.
the part you're looking to do the radar on is not where the gas station was.
Well, no, we want to do the whole part, but I think we are much more likely to find remains in that part by where Santander Bank is.
Yeah, and then where you said with the remediation, actually, we had done a story some time ago about gas tanks leaking, and they have a 20-year lifespan. Like after 20 years, they're going to leak. That's kind of like how they make them. So if they are still there and there was any gas in it's going into the environment, it's that because they will leak after 20 years. The seals on them and stuff like that. Because I had spoken with the U.S. Geological, I don't think it was the Navy. I forget which department it
Mhm.
was, and they were like, "Yeah, they only last for 20 years. So if you still have gas in them, and because this was with regard to the Graniteville quarry, which
Mhm.
is becoming the BJ's, and they're going to have gas tanks under there, which was why we were trying to find out what happens with the gas tanks. And the gas tanks only have a stable life of 20 years. And after 20 years, they're supposed to dig them up, either reseal them or make totally new ones and get rid of the old ones. Otherwise, they will leak into the environment. So that was actually one of the concerns because there's going to be a gas station there. So, and that, and it's like right next to a wetlands. So if there are still gas tanks under this cemetery, they're leaking already. Like if there was any gas left in them.
Absolutely. Yeah. If they were sunk in the ground in the 50s, and I don't know what the construction, I mean, sometimes things were better made back
That's true
then than they
too.
are today.
That is true.
I live in a 150-year-old house, and there are certain things that it's like they don't make them like this anymore, and there are certain things that are just like falling to pieces around me. It depends, but regardless, yes, we're talking about going on almost 70 years. So even if they were, top-notch gas tanks, and it does actually pose the question, because I've always wondered, and this is just a guess, this is not gospel by any means, but I have wondered why it went from a gas station to a shopping plaza. Now, it could be that the owners saw that it would be more valuable as a shopping plaza than as a gas station. Because when you look at the pictures of like the last days of that Shell station, it is like abandoned. It's a mess. There's graffiti. It looks terrible. So I do wonder if it was easier to just convert it to a shopping center rather than uproot these tanks and, put in new ones or whatever. I don't know. That's just a guess, but I am unsure as to why it switched like that, particularly because the people who then switched it, the Anjuli family, again, not an indictment against the Anjuli family, but, I don't, but they had a history of owning car dealerships across Staten Island. So it seemed logically, gas station, car dealership. Same thing with the person who owned it previously. Max Menden owned a series of car dealerships across Staten Island, but had this be a gas station.
Yeah, I wonder if just hypothetically if it's just a bad place to put a gas station because there was a gas station on the corner of Forest and Crystal for many years, which is now a different shopping plaza. Now that's the CVS and it's a day by day something, and apparently a car dealership too. That used to be a gas station. Nobody ever went to it. And it was like so run down, and then it became like abandoned, and finally they got rid of it. So it's just maybe that's just that area
That could
is
very
bad
well
gas
be,
station.
yeah, because that sounds like the exact same story. I mean, if I didn't know it was a cemetery when I see the photos of what it originally looked like, it had that sort of like space age era look to it. It was, as far as gas stations go, it was quite nice looking. But yeah, it was just totally derelict by the time it was sold.
And now the next question was, and you had said, you had mentioned about the monuments that they wanted to put on Santander. Are there any other plans to put like a different monument or signage? Is there any signage yet? I know that there was a cherry tree that was planted there.
Santander paid for the New York City Parks Department has an Adopt a Tree program, and I had noticed that in one of the tree beds right in front of the shopping plaza on Forest, there was a dead tree, or actually at that point it was a stump. So they paid to have a cherry tree planted there. They didn't want to plant a cherry tree. They said cherry trees aren't going to survive in this amount of sunlight or something, but we pushed back and we were like, we want a cherry tree. So they put in a cherry tree, and so far so good, and it bloomed. And so it's yeah. So that's one thing that makes me very happy. It's a very small thing, but it's I don't know. There's something about that really speaks to me in a way I can't quite identify. Maybe because my father is buried next to a cherry tree too. I don't know. But the fact that, you're able to communicate that this was called Cherry Lane just through a cherry tree, I particularly like that. In terms of other signage, well, we have the Benjamin Prine Way, which was co-named, and to date, it is the only street that is co-named for a formerly enslaved person from New York City. We have Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, but they are from Maryland. Benjamin Prine is from New York. There are no other formerly enslaved people who have streets co-named for them from New York. And the fact that it's on Staten Island, I find doubly satisfying, given our history of race relations in the borough. So the Memorial Garden intends to have a boulder that was chosen by one of Benjamin Prine's descendants with a plaque affixed to it that would explain the history of the property. And Councilmember Camilla Hanks is trying to get some sort of landmark certification for the site. I think it's called a silver certification, which basically means this was a historic site, but the historical parts of it no longer exist, yet it's still a site of historic importance. So that is ongoing. And she's the chair, I think, of the Preservation Commission of New York. So this would be, and she ran on a platform of preservation too. So I think that this fits in a lot of what her mission is.
Okay, cool. So I guess, what is the ultimate goal for the activists and yourself involved in this Staten Island Cemetery project?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned it. I mean,
I guess.
My goal is, I am only able to document. I cannot push anyone in one way or another. I can only, show people as they go about their ways of memorializing, getting the word out, et cetera, et cetera. So what my goal is as a filmmaker with this is to produce a film that shows other people who have their own Cherry Lane cemeteries that they're dealing with, or ones that are, derelict, obliterated in terrible shape, what they can do and how they can come together and how they can reverse what has happened. I mean, what I do tell people, especially the descendants who I've been filming, is that the worst has already happened. So it can't get any worse. It can only get better. Or it can stay the status quo. And it's already gotten better in small ways with the cherry tree, with the street co-naming, hopefully with the Memorial Garden. the ultimate goal, I believe, for the people involved is to have the ground penetrating radar done, is to find what remains are there, and then to see what happens. There is a school of thought that says that, the remains should be repatriated to another cemetery and given another proper burial. There's also the belief that if you remove, again, that which makes this historical, you remove its historical importance. So maybe it is better to keep them there, but do something different, work with the property owner somehow, have some sort of interpretive center. I don't know. But the goal is really to see ultimately what is underground, what is still there, and figure out from there what can be done. Because right now we're just working off of, hopes and by we, I mean those involved, hopes and guesses. And I mean, there could be remains under Livermore. They, things get pushed too. There will be remains that, we don't know about and may never know about. We may know about 50 years from now, 100 years from now. But what we can find at least is the goal to find some sort of answers in that respect.
So, and if they, like in general, when a cemetery is found somewhere, like if they find remains when they're doing a building project or something, where are the remains supposed to go? Like if they do it right?
It depends on the people who are involved. For instance, with the African burial ground, obviously nobody knows there are no names of people. There are just remains, and you can only, guess from the state of the body. Some people, there's also this belief, I mean, there are a lot of incorrect beliefs about the institution of slavery in the North. A, that it didn't exist. B, that it existed, but it wasn't so bad. And, you will find remains of people who were tortured to death for unknown reasons, possibly because they tried to escape or possibly for other reasons. I don't know. So the idea that it wasn't so bad, I've been working with Debbie Ann Page, who's a historian on Staten Island, and she said you have to, think of who is saying that it's not so bad. Is it the people who were enslaved who are saying it wasn't so bad, or is it the people who were who were owning people or their descendants, or how we like to feel about ourselves? Yeah, we did this, but we did it in a more humane way, which is definitely not the case. It was different in that we don't have cotton plantations in the North. But to answer your question about, what was it? Who is what happens to? Okay, so I think it depends on the community. With the African burial ground, the remains were studied at Howard, and then they were given a ceremonial burial back at where they were. So there is that memorial site now by City Hall in Lower Manhattan. And one of the people who runs it, or not runs it, but worked there and helped to facilitate a lot of what happened in the design. Her name is Peggy King Yorda. She's a consultant on our film. She was just in a documentary called A Story of Bones about African cemetery that was discovered on the island of St. Helena when they tried to build, they did build an airport, specifically a runway. They found people who had died and were buried there. There are other people who would want the remains buried elsewhere. The decision, I believe, rests with the descendants of the descendants of those who were buried there. So whatever their desires are at the end of the day, whether they want them reburied with other family. I mean, David Thomas and Ruth Ann Hills, who I've been working with a lot on the film, and they're Benjamin Prine's great grandchildren. I think ultimately they may want them buried there. A lot of their family is buried at Lake Cemetery. But, it remains to be seen. As long as something is done,
Right.
you know.
And just to your point
Right.
of what you were saying about like who's saying whether it was so bad or not, there was a review that that we had done for books about indentured servitude versus chattel slavery, and there was one difference between chattel slavery and indentured servitude, which was at 7 years they would be freed, but they had a lifespan of 2 years. In almost all cases, their average lifespan was 2 years. So the vast majority of them were bought and sold on the auction blocks the same way as chattel slaves were. They were owned and passed down through wills the same way. The only difference was that in the rare instance that someone survived 7 years, they would turn them out into the woods and say, here you go, bye. They wouldn't give them anything or anything. Like, they would just be like, oh, there's land over there that way. You can go try and find your way or whatever. But like, and so a lot of people, like when I was taught in school about indentured servitude, that's not what they said it was. They said it was just, oh, they sold their labor or whatever, and that was it. It was like, but that's not really the real story, and nobody really told the real story of it until like many years later. So it's kind of like what perspective it's coming from really matters.
Exactly. And even the term indentured servitude, I mean, you say that even to a kid, and even I'm confused when I hear that. Like, indentured servitude, is this like a serf? Are we talking like Russia? Are we talking like, what does that even mean? So yeah, and the fact that, when you were asking, why hadn't this been written about? There had been articles in the past. Stevie Lacey Pendleton, I don't know if you remember her. She used to write for the Advance, I think mostly in the 80s and 90s. And she had written at least one or two articles about this spot, particularly as it pertained to poltergeist. The first time she wrote about it were a few years. And there are still people who like say, is the 7-Eleven haunted? Or, and I was like, not that I've come across. But if you don't know it's your family, first of all, odds are you may not even see the article. But even if you do, it's not like you're going to read it and think, oh my God, could this be my family buried under there? Even if you're a Black Staten Islander, because as we were all taught, it happened in the South. So it couldn't be, it couldn't be like, even though it was called the old slaves burial ground sometimes, that must have been people who came from the South and came to New York, during the Great Migration or something. There wasn't a lot of, A plus B equals C thought involved when you see this headline. You just kind of see a headline and move on. So historians knew about it. Richard Dickinson, who was the late borough historian, knew about it. And I think you saw he had tried to get a memorial done in the 90s. And all that was able to happen was a plaque in the lobby of the First Nationwide Bank at the time. And the bank changed hands so many times and the plaque is long gone. And why a plaque would be in the lobby of a bank anyway to, mark the historic significance of a site is ridiculous. But yeah, it's more like, and as Camilla said in the trailer, it was more like a myth, like maybe there had been. And, I think the fact that it didn't look like a cemetery kind of prevented a lot of people from actually knowing. And the fact that burials stopped around 1910 or so prevented a lot of people from knowing that it wasn't like it was, an actual cemetery that looked like a cemetery that was paved over and then became a gas station. You know,
Right,
would have
right.
been a much different story.
And that's so funny that you mentioned that about poltergeist. I was just thinking about that this morning. I was like, oh, it could be haunted. But you'd have to ask the 7-Eleven person who works at 4 in the morning. They'd be the one who'd hear all the sounds.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because when I first went to, and I had walked past that site a whole bunch of times, and you know, Edward Menden, who bought the property, he also bought that shopping plaza across the street. Had he not died in the plane crash, it's possible he would have owned half of Staten Island at one point. But I'm trying to think. I have I have a bit of COVID brain going on still, even after a few months. But yeah, when I first went onto the site, I didn't know what to expect. And I didn't know if there was going to be any sort of traces of any. I just didn't know. I thought, well, this was a cemetery. Surely we'll see something. I don't know what it is, but I'll see something or I'll feel something. I don't know why I thought that. I'm not, you know, I'm no psychic. And, you know, you feel nothing. You hear nothing. There's no one crying out to you. There's no eerie sense of, other than the fact that it's sort of this cognitive dissonance. Like, yes, I know this, there were people paved over here, but I still can't make that connection on some level, or it's just too, even for me, and I know this is not my family, even for me, it's too frightening to even make that connection. So you kind of just not put blinders on, but kind of block it a little bit in your mind. And it's very easy to, because there are no remnants of anything. The one thing that the landlord has done, we filmed legislators touring the site in December, and among them was Charles Fall, and that's his district. And even someone up in Montgomery, New York, which is in Ulster County, where they have an 18th century Black and Indigenous burial ground where there are a number of burials that, you know, it's been undisturbed, but they don't have any records of anyone. So it's kind of the flip side of Cherry Lane. It's undisturbed, but at least at Cherry Lane, we don't know the names of everyone, but we do have some of the names, whereas this place has most, if not all, of the remains, but no names. So we did a tour of the site and filmed it for the documentary. And what the landlord had done was the dumpsters were left open. So there's usually a fence that locks them up because there's dumpsters, you know, for the various businesses to throw their trash out. He had one dumpster out on a parking spot and another one within the fenced in part, but the fenced in part was open. So what happened was, mind you, this is on a burial ground. People just from the neighborhood or around, or there's a restaurant there, or from the 7-Eleven, would eat at the parking lot and just use it as like their own trash dump, or people would go to the bathroom there. And while we were filming, one of the tenants was throwing out garbage at a dumpster that was already overflowing and, you know, covering their face. And right after that, the landlord locked up the dumpsters. Previously, he claimed he had tried to, but the locks were always broken by homeless people. And it's been going on 4 months now, and no person, homeless or otherwise, has broken the locks so far.
Okay, well, that's good. That's
Mm-hmm.
good. So, has the community been instrumental in helping to bring attention to this forgotten cemetery?
Absolutely. They have really rallied. Bobby Digi and Canvas Institute are working on doing a fundraiser for what they want to put is, do you know what the KNOW NYC signs are? They're mostly in Manhattan and Brooklyn, like most things. They're kind of long vertical signs, and they're in historic areas. Like there's one around Herald Square that'll show a person and be like, "Hi, I'm so and so. I not Mr. Macy, but someone else who had a connection to that site." And then on the flip side, on the other side of the sign will be like some information, some photos about, the historic importance of like Herald Square or, somewhere else. So we want to have one of those signs put, possibly on the corner of Forest and Livermore. That is the Department of Transportation's jurisdiction. That is not the landlord's jurisdiction. But, that costs money not only to design and design to their specifications, and they are very exacting in their specifications. So there's only a certain number of people who can really do it. And because of that, they charge quite a bit, because you can't just get any designer to do it, because it's going to be an endless process. You really need to have someone who has dealt with the Department of Transportation before. And there's also, the fabrication fees. You want it to be like this indestructible steel, the fees for installation, and so on and so forth. So he's raising money for that, and also for beautification of the property. One thing we do want to try and have is on the property these beautifully designed recycling, and this sounds insane, but the Department of Transportation has created, they're almost like flower shaped recycling and trash bins that I just think, as long as this is going to be a shopping plaza, at least for the near future, why not make it as nice looking as possible? If we're going to separate it from the other millions of shopping plazas and places of business on Forest Avenue, why don't we do it by making it look nicer? We're never going to be able to make a shopping plaza pretty, but there are small ways that we can memorialize them, even in making these beautiful garbage bins, which sounds crazy, but it's the little things that indicate that this is a special place, that this is different from other places. So that is one other way to memorialize, and that's the community. The Staten Island chapter of the NAACP is very much on board. Like I said, Camilla Hanks is trying to get landmark designation for the site. Charles Fall is looking to get put his letterhead on a sign-up sheet for the ground penetrating radar survey, and the people involved will take it to the various organizations on Staten Island and beyond to have them sign on to this. And the descendant community has been very involved too. I mean, we had the co-naming ceremony last year. We had a follow-up dinner at Shawnee's house, which has now become world famous thanks to the Times. One of two restaurants on Staten Island that was reviewed, that was named the top 100 restaurants in New York City. Just I think the overall, not only the Black community, but I am heartened by, if not the actions necessarily, but at least the buy-in of the white community in acknowledging that this is a disgrace. I mean, you're always going to have voices that say, what's done is done, and this happens all the time, and this is just another like woke nonsense. But the large majority, particularly on Staten Island, of people who really do feel that this is something that should have never happened, I feel is heartening. And so if we can just get all of these people together, and, if the descendant community can, and really do a push to keep moving and keep the momentum going. And so far it's worked. And I mean, they were able to get all those legislators to come to a parking lot in December on Staten Island. I mean, that is no mean feat. So there are people who really believe in this.
Well, that's